Hello, AP Bio. Welcome to our first video lecture for ecology. So the 8th and final unit in the College Board's AP Bio curriculum is on ecology. You can see from this slide, this is chapters 40 through 43 in your textbook. I'm dividing this into an ecology part 1 video and an ecology part 2 video, where we're going to hit the topics we need to hit from these 4 chapters. So let's get started. So this is a picture of Jack, my son. In this picture, he is 5 years old, I believe, and he has made himself a bird's nest on our back porch from items in our backyard, and he is a little baby bird. And for some reason, that seemed appropriate to me to introduce ecology. Okay, so ecology is a very important, obviously, branch of science. There's a lot of vocabulary we should just sort of tick off here at the beginning. So ecology, by definition, is a scientific study of the interactions between organisms and the environment. You know, we started the year back in our first video talking about the idea of reductionism. And most bio textbooks, go the route of starting with a very, very small, like we started the year with atoms and molecules. Then we went into parts of a cell and the cell, then we did, cell division. Then we did all the genetic stuff, and we've built throughout the year to bigger. So we started small, and we're going to end big. And ecosystems is obviously the biggest in terms of the scale. Some folks argue that actually you should do ecology first because ecology encompasses everything else. Most textbooks, though, put it at the end of the book. An ecosystem is the community of organisms in an area and the physical factors with which they interact. So a population versus a community, this is an important distinction. A population is a group of individuals of the same species living in the same area. So say you have a population of dragonflies in Greenville, South Carolina, same species, same area. You can have a population of dragonflies in a different area, but that's a different population, right? A community is a group of populations of different species in the same area. So the community might be, a patch of woods in South Carolina where there's more than one species. So both populations and communities are in the same place. A population is a single species. A community is a group of species living in the same area. Weather versus climate. This is a super important distinction we should make. So weather are the conditions of the atmosphere over a short period of time. So weather is short term. Climate is the long-term prevailing weather conditions in an area. If I ask you, is it raining today? That's the weather. If I ask you, what's the average yearly rainfall for South Carolina? That's climate. This is an important distinction we'll talk about in the second video when we discuss climate change. But climate is, our long-term patterns. Just because it's hot today versus tomorrow doesn't mean the climate's changing. Changes in weather do not mean the climate's changing unless you have long-term patterns of change. If the average high temperature of a location changes from year to year, that's a climate change. If it gets hotter tomorrow, that's a weather change. So abiotic versus biotic factors. So abiotic factors, the root bio means life. A means not as a prefix. So abiotic factors are the factors that are not living that affect the environment. So you can read this: temperature, precipitation, light, wind, rocks. Rocks can be important. Rocks are abiotic. Seashells, if you count seashells as rocks, seashells came from things that were living, but let's not split hairs. Biotic factors would be all the factors that make up the living component of an environment. So the things that live there: predators, prey, bacteria that might live in the soil, moss, grass, things that are living. So in terms of biotic factors, so let's give some examples. So predation. If something eats something or is eaten by something, that's a biotic factor that obviously affects the ecosystem because you're being eaten or you are doing the eating. Herbivory would be eating plants. So for example, sea urchins, we're going to discuss sea urchins in more detail later in this video. Sea urchins can feed off seaweed, and sea urchins can just completely annihilate the amount of seaweed in a marine ecosystem, which has a huge effect on everything else that lives there. Mutualism, parasitism, competition, we're going to discuss these later. Obviously, if you're competing for the same resources, or if you're, if you're a sea anemone housing clownfish like Nemo, that's mutualism. Those are biotic factors that affect an ecosystem. So, the AP exam loves having you interpret graphs. So let's interpret a graph together. So this is a graph showing the effect of sea urchins, these purple things, and limpets, which are relatives of snails. Both of these live in marine ecosystems, and how their presence affects seaweed cover. So here you can see over the course of several months across actually 2 different years, 82 to 84. I guess that's 3 years actually, isn't it? And how the percentage of seaweed cover changes. If I asked you, let's just do some practice questions. If I asked you what the control was, well, it's labeled. The control is when you have both urchins and limpets. It's the red line. And under the control, the seaweed cover is basically 0, right? If I remove limpets and urchins, this purple line, what happens to the seaweed cover? It spikes up to 100%. So something is eating seaweed. So the first obvious question is, and you can see the blue line and the green line, how they change. If this were multiple choice and the AP exam asks you what was eating the seaweed, what would you say? Let me pause for 5 seconds while you figure out what you would say. So sea urchins are eating the seaweed because when I remove the sea urchins, the seaweed comes back, right? If I just remove the limpets, the seaweed is still very, very low. So the limpets are not eating the seaweed. All right. Quick questions. In this experiment, what was the dependent variable? All right. The dependent variable would be the percentage of seaweed cover, right? Because that's the y-axis. If this were a free response question, make sure that you write seaweed cover and include percentage, because they're going to want you to include the unit also. If I said what was the if I said what was the independent variable, there's actually a couple things you could say. You could say that it's the month of the year. We've learned that the independent variable is what's on the x-axis. So saying the month and the year would not be wrong. But on this graph, there's multiple lines. So you could also say the independent variable, which is what you controlled in the experiment, would be the presence or absence of limpets or urchins. Okay, so independent variable is either time or the presence of urchins and limpets. The dependent variable is seaweed coverage and percentage. So abiotic factors, these are non-living things that affect an ecosystem. So temperature, water, oxygen, salinity, sunlight, rocks and soil, obviously they have an impact, but they're not things that themselves are alive. So population ecology. So this is a whole branch of ecology. So, the term density, this isn't a new term. Density is just the number of individuals per unit area. So the denser a population, the more that there are in a given place. It's density. Dispersion is how they're spread out. All right, are they evenly spread out? Are they in patches? Do the birds only live in the treetops? Or can they live in nests on the ground? Things like that. So birth and immigration with an I increase the population. So when birds are born, you get more birds. If birds immigrate with an I, that increases the numbers. Death and immigration with an E decrease the population, right? So if the birth rate and the death rate are the same, overall, is the population increasing? No. If immigration and emigration are the same, it stays the same, the population size. To immigrate with an E means to leave. To immigrate with an I means to come, okay? So this graph shows what are called 3 different survivorship curves. It's worth just talking about this briefly. So the x-axis is showing percentage of maximum lifespan. So if you get to 100%, that means that you've lived as long as the maximum lifespan is for your species. And this shows number of survivors. This is a logarithmic scale. Notice you go from 1 to 10, 10 to 100, 100 to 1,000. So you're timesing it by 10 every time. So the spacing here, it might look even, but it's not. This is a logarithmic scale. You would use a logarithmic scale if you had you need to go to a big number, but there's a big change with the smaller numbers, and you need to have a bunch of different numbers on the same graph. so it doesn't look sloppy. You might use logarithmic paper. We also used logarithmic paper when we did gel electrophoresis with the DNA bands that was graphed on log paper. So a type 1 survivorship curve, this is showing up a human. Like early on, most things get at least to midlife, and you don't get lots of death till the end of the maximum life cycle. So you have if you're born, you have a very good chance of surviving. Most things don't die till the end. A type 2, like this little mammal, is this a squirrel or a guinea pig? Not guinea pig. I'm not sure what that is, but let's just call it a squirrel. Where the likelihood of you dying doesn't change depending upon how old you are. Not incredibly common. A type 3 curve, this is some kind of little marine critter. Most death happens early on. So if you are born, it's not likely that you're going to survive. But if you do survive, say to midlife, you have a great chance of surviving to the maximum life. So, this shows, what's that, an oyster, whatever that is. I like to think of like sea turtles. Sea turtles, most of them, when they're hatched, do not survive, all right? You might get 100 sea turtles that are hatched, and a very small percent actually make it. But if you do, get, say, to this point, you have a very good chance of living a very, very, very long life. All right, so most don't survive the early years or months, but if you do survive, you are pretty much guaranteed to live to maximum lifespan, okay? So humans, a good chance of surviving past birth. Oysters, low chance. You can see how the two curves, 1 and 3, are different. So the exponential and logistic models of growth. So this gets us into some math. And the math portion of this, we are going to do in class. So we're going to go through some equations, and we'll actually use the equations in class. For the video, we're just going to go through the concepts. And these equations are also all on the formula sheet for the AP exam. So population growth, this is an equation that shows something incredibly simple, right? dn over dt. So dn is the change in population size over time, is the birth rate minus the death rate, all right? I mean, it could be simpler, right? If 10 are born a year and 5 of them die, overall, you had a net gain of 5 over a year, all right? This equation's on the AP exam on the formula sheet, and this is, to me, this is showing mathematically a very, 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 very simple concept, right? So there's two different kinds of growth, though. There's exponential growth and there's logistic growth, okay? And these differences it's still pretty simple, but they are not quite as simple as what we just talked about. So let me show you a quick picture. I'll put this slide back. You know what an exponential curve looks like. Exponential growth a graph that looks like this. Starts out pretty slow and then increases very, very rapidly, right? Exponential growth in a population is when you have sort of idealized growth, when growth is explosive, when there's really nothing that's stopping a species from increasing its numbers. So plenty of resources, lots of reproduction, minimal predators, your population is exploding, all right? If you look at the equation, this term just means the growth rate, or I'm not sorry, this is the change in individuals over time. R max is the term for the growth rate, and the max would indicate that you have, basically the maximum growth rate that you can have. Nothing is slowing it down. And N is the population size, right? So if I have a population of 100 and the growth rate is, if this were 2, then this term would be 200 additional ones every year, or whatever the time is. Again, we're going to actually do sample math problems for these equations in class. For right now, let's just get the concepts, all right? Exponential growth, you see, again, when there's nothing that's stopping growth, right? If you were to graph this shows a growth rate of 1, this shows 0.5, so obviously this one's steeper, but these are all J-shaped curves which show exponential growth, all right? Case study, this was a case in Kruger National Park in South Africa where you had elephants. This is showing over many, many decades, the elephants were hunted, and when hunting was banned, you got rid of the elephant's predators, which were humans, you can see the population just explodes. That's exponential growth, okay? Now, exponential growth is, it's not uncommon, but it's obviously not typical because things limit growth, right? Carrying capacity is the term that we use for the idea that something is going to limit population size to where you might get exponential growth to a point, but then it levels off, right? Carrying capacity, which is used with a capital K, I'm not quite sure why they use K. I guess capital C was used for something else. You know, think about uh, environment. Think about, I don't know, let's birds. I like doing birds. Birds in a park in Greenville. Let's say birds in Falls Park. How many birds can Falls Park house? Well, you need to know how many resources. Are there any predators? Like, how much water do you have? Or you can think about like nesting sites. Birds need to build nests, and if this species of bird builds nest in a tree, tree branches aren't unlimited, right? So say that Falls Park can house 100 nesting sites. If there's 5 birds, we're great. If there's 10, we're great. If there's 50, we're great. If there's 99, we're great. If there's 100, we're at carrying capacity. If there's 101, then that one bird either is going to die or has to go somewhere else. If there's 200 birds, then you're way past carrying capacity. That's going to cause stressors, right? Carrying capacity leads us to the logistic growth model. The logistic growth model, and if you look at the equation, it looks a lot fancier, but it's really just the exponential equation here, where I added this extra term. K is carrying capacity, and N is the number of, or it's the population size. So you add this special term to get the growth rate, which includes carrying capacity. And the closer you are to carrying capacity, the slower the growth rate is going to be. And remember, on the AP exam, not only do you get these formulas, but you get what they stand for too. Like this term here is just cut and paste off the formula sheet. If you forget what K is, they tell you what K is. When you graph logistic growth, so the blue line here is exponential growth. Logistic growth is this red line. It's an S-shaped curve because, again, growth starts out really fast because, again, if there's 100 nesting sites and there's only 10 birds, you can increase the numbers, greatly. Here we're getting to like 99 birds, 100 birds, although my y-axis here is way more than 100. But you get the idea. The growth rate slows down once you hit K. All right. So some real populations. So this graph shows paramecia, little single-cell protists. These will be growing in like a culture dish where there are limited resources. Each dot represents a number of paramecia over a given time period. If you're looking at this graph, if I asked you what was carrying capacity, like I want a number, you would say right at 900 or so paramecia. It's where the graph levels off. This graph shows Daphnia. Daphnia are in water fleas. They're little freshwater crustaceans. In Daphnia, like in this graph, you see, look at the black dots. You way overshot carrying capacity, then you came back down. So overall, it's logistic. The carrying capacity, if I look at that red line, would be about 100 and, I don't know, let's say 130, 140 Daphnia. Why did it overshoot it? Well, there's a hint in the picture. If you know Daphnia, which maybe you do, maybe you don't, this Daphnia is pregnant. All these little green things back here are eggs. And, Daphnia might produce many eggs at once. So maybe you weren't at carrying capacity yet. And then a bunch of Daphnia had a bunch of offspring to where you way overloaded the system. And a lot of those offspring died because there wasn't enough resources or there was a predator or something, and it brought it back down. All right. This slide here is basically what I just said. Some populations might overshoot K, especially if you like have a lot of offspring at one time that the environment can't support, and then a lot of them die off. All right. Both exponential and logistic growth, they're growth models. They, the real world might not perfectly be exponential or logistic, but they're useful for predicting what the growth rate for populations are going to be, okay, or where you are on the growth rate right now. So density independent and density dependent factors. So, independent means it doesn't affect you. Dependent means things do affect you. So density independent factors are things that it doesn't matter how many birds there are, the same percentage will be affected by whatever your stressor is. So take weather or climate, like say there's a flood, all right? There's a flood and the flood kills 5% of your birds, right? If you have a few birds, you kill 5%. If you have a ton of birds, you still kill 5%. Now you might be killing more birds. The flood might have a bigger death toll, but if the percentage of death or birth is the same, it's density independent, all right? It doesn't matter how many there were, the same birth or death rate happens. Density dependent are things where the number of offspring makes a difference. So like look at the first example, it says, competition for resources. Again, your nesting sites of birds. If you have 100 nesting sites, only 5 birds, you're fine. 100 birds, you're right there. 200 birds, 400 birds, huge difference in the effect of that stressor, right? Diseases spread faster when there are more organisms to spread the disease. A higher population is going to have a higher, not just percentage of death, all right? If the percents are the same, it's independent. But if you have a higher percent of birth or death because of the stressor, it's density dependent. Predation, right? If a predator is eating the gazelle, if you have way more gazelle in one place, the predator, it's easier for the predator, right? So predation is also density dependent, because when you have more of them, you have a higher percent. Again, let me just say it one more time, in case you get confused by this. If the percent of death or rate is the same in populations, it's density independent. Just because the flood kills more birds, well, did it kill a higher percentage of birds? If it killed a higher percentage of birds, it would be density dependent. Things like weather or climate are usually independent. Things like territory, marking your territory, diseases, predation, resources, toxins, those are usually density dependent. The last point here calls this negative feedback, because the population gets to a certain size and then carrying capacity pushes back on it. So this is an example of negative feedback, where the more growth you have, the more those stressors have an impact. This graph just shows a correlation between, I'm not sure where this was, but the numbers of wolves and moose. Obviously the wolf is killing the moose. When you have lots of wolves, the moose population goes down. And then here, I'm not sure what happened to the wolves, but the wolves went away. Maybe they were being hunted, and the moose population went up. So this is an example of predation, right? And this is obviously a density dependent effect, because the more wolves you have, the more it affects the moose. And then, the fewer wolves you have, the more moose you have. All right, interactions with the community. We can go through these relatively quickly. So these are all different categories of ways that species can interact. And honestly, it's most important that for each of these, if I gave you an example, you could tell me which one I was talking about. So for example, coevolution. So the best examples here are two species whose evolution are sort of linked. And an example would be flowering plants and insects. So there are species of flowers, for instance, that are pollinated by a single species of bird, or vice versa. So if you are a bird and you only pollinate one kind of flower, if that flower goes extinct, what are you going to do? Obviously, you're going to have to adapt. So these are examples of two species whose evolutionary paths are tied because they interact with one another very closely. The example usually you give is between flowers and insects. Predation, this one's pretty simple. This is when one species kills another one. This obviously would lead to one species having fewer numbers, but it also leads to adaptations of the prey species, things like plants giving off chemicals for defense, excuse me, camouflage, which is called cryptic coloration, things like mimicry. This slide shows some kind of non-venomous larva that looks an awfully lot like this venomous snake. So obviously this species has evolved to appear like a venomous species so that predators of it would be warned away. The competitive exclusion principle, this is a really important concept. It's a simple concept in actuality, but a lot of times kids get this confused. So this is a concept that states that two species competing for the same limiting resources cannot coexist in the same niche. So your niche, this is an important vocabulary word. The definition is the specific set of biotic and abiotic resources used by an organism. In layman's terms, it's basically in your ecosystem, what do you interact with and what interacts with you? I think of it sometimes in my head, I think of the term sphere of influence, sort of like my definition. So like in terms of a school, like what's my niche? What's my sphere of influence? Well, it would mainly be my classroom. In my classroom are the things that I interact with, including the students, which are biotic, but also includes my computer, the stuff in my lab, even things like the Wi-Fi. Like the Wi-Fi is part of my niche, right? Now, there are times when my niche expands. If I go to the cafeteria for something or go use the copy machine, but basically your ecological niche are the things the organism interacts with and what interacts with it, all right? And if two species niches overlap, there's gonna be competition. Character displacement is the tendency of characteristics to be more divergent in sympatric populations of two species than in allopatric populations of the same two species. So just to review, sympatric means two things live in the same place. Allopatric means they're living in different places. And the best way to teach the competitive exclusion principle is to actually do an example. So this slide, excuse me, shows two species of lizard. They look very similar. They're clearly lizards. They live in the same ecosystem, but if you look at where they actually like reside, this first one likes to perch on like the top of posts, fence posts in the sun. And this one likes to perch or to sit in higher branches that are in shade, all right? So the character here is where they actually physically are, and they're being displaced, or they've displaced that character, and that they're in different places. So their niches, at the closest level don't actually overlap. They've displaced one another or displaced themselves from one another, so they're not competing for the exact same resources. This case study, this one is a really good example. So this is showing two species of bird. We're just going to call it the orange one and the green one. If you look at the trait of beak depth, how like deep or how wide their beak is, this picture calls it depth. Obviously, the bird's beak is important based upon what the bird is eating. We've discussed this before. So here I have the orange birds living on one island, or one, I think these are islands. Here I have the green one, a different set of islands. They're allopatric. They're not in the same place. They don't encounter one another. And if I ask you what the average beak depth was, I'm looking at the number. So 10 is right here. This one, the average looks about 10. Here it's about 10. They have basically the same average beak depth. All right. Now, same species, but in this island, they're living together. They meet one another. And look what's happened. The average beak depth for the orange birds, and again, they're not really orange, I'm just looking at the color of the graph, is 8, and the green ones is 12. So that character has been displaced. They've evolved in different, or the populations have changed in different directions because they're in the same place. When they're in different places, the average is more or less the same. So that's the competitive exclusion principle, which is when you have character displacement because two things are living in the same place. Okay. Symbiosis, this is stuff you did in like elementary school. So parasitism is when you have a parasite and a host. The host is what benefits. I'm sorry, the host is what is hurt. The parasite benefits. So this shows a tapeworm and a mammal. Obviously, the tapeworm is the parasite. The host is the mammal. You could have a tick on a dog, fleas on a dog, strep throat, bacteria that infects humans. Okay. Mutualism would be when both species benefit. So here I have a clownfish living in a sea anemone. The clownfish gets protection from predators. The sea anemone gets whatever food scraps might fall out of the sea anemone or the clownfish's mouth. There's lots of examples of this in nature. If both species benefit, it's called mutualism. That's probably not a new word for you. Commensalism is an example. and this is a little bit debatable actually, where two species interact. One benefits and the other is not helped or hurt. The examples usually you give, like this last word, the word epiphyte. Epiphytes are plants that grow on another substance, like ivy up a tree or moss on a tree. You could say barnacles on a whale. Like the ivy or the moss, it grows up the tree, so it's getting height. The barnacles can't move themselves; they just filter feed in the water. So the fact that the barnacles are on the whale that moves, like it's moving to the ocean, so food's coming to them basically. And the tree isn't harmed or hurt. Now, if the plant was parasitic, like mistletoe, that's different. But here we're talking about ones that aren't parasitic. The whale's not hurt. This is a little bit debatable because, like, if the moss gets really heavy, I guess the moss could potentially harm the tree. If the barnacles were on the whale's eyes, like its eyelids, that could harm the whale. So the fact that it harms or doesn't harm, it kind of depends on the actual situation. So some biology textbooks are moving away from the idea of commensalism. They say that it doesn't really exist in nature and it's hard to define. Either way, just know that if you see commensalism on the AP exam, one benefits and the other one isn't really affected at all. So we're wrapping it up here. So this slide's actually super duper important. Dominant species versus keystone species. So a keystone in an arch, like an ancient Roman arch, the keystone's the one in the middle, like at the top, that like all the other ones put pressure on. If you remove the keystone of the arch falls down. So a dominant species means it's the one that's the most common, like it's the most prevalent, right? The dominant species is the one that has the most examples in an ecosystem. The keystone species is the one that has the most, if not the strongest, a very strong control on the community, even though it might not be the most abundant, all right? The example that I want to give, here I mentioned sea stars and intertidal communities. So this is a very, very, very famous experiment done in the middle part of the 20th century. This gentleman's named Robert Payne. He's one of the most important people in modern ecology. And we'll talk about this experiment actually more in class because this like changed ecology big time. And what he did, he was working with intertidal pools. And you see these mainly on the West Coast, not so much the East Coast. There are these pools by the ocean. They're usually kind of rocky, where the tide comes in, the water's pretty high. When the tide goes out, a lot of things are exposed, right? They're intertidal. And living there, you have algae, you have mussels, you have sea urchins, you have sea stars, you have moss, lots of things thrive in these intertidal communities. Lots of species variation. So Pisaster is this species of sea star that you're seeing here. And what Robert Payne did is he basically did a series of experiments over the 60s and 70s where he would go to some intertidal pools and just leave them alone. But some he would go and he would pry the sea stars off the rocks and throw them in the ocean. Like he didn't kill them, but he threw them far enough away to where they weren't going to come back to that pool. And he would come back and basically he would count the number of species that were present. And if you look at the graph here with the sea stars, with Pisaster, there's lots of species present, 15 or 20. Without the sea stars, the number of species plummets. And this was not what was expected because sea stars are like the top of the food chain. They're like the bullies. And here you can see a sea star feeding on a mussel. Mussels are attached to the rocks. And the sea star basically, sea stars can move and they sort of crawl on top of a mussel and they can like push out their stomach through the little opening in the center and put their stomach into a mussel and digest the mussels really from the inside out. They're very, very carnivorous. They're sneaky predators. So you think that they're the bad guys, and you think that if you get rid of sea stars, the other species will flourish. Well, look what happened. You got rid of sea stars and the other species plummeted. The diversity went down big time. And what was happening basically was that the sea star keeping the mussel population at bay meant that other species could come in, right? So when the mussels didn't have a predator, mussels are very, very adaptive. They're very good at exploding their populations. They can have exponential growth. And without the sea stars, the mussels took over the pools to where he would come back year after year, and the pools without sea stars were 100% mussels, and there was nothing else there, right? It was depressing, right? And the idea was that the apex predator, the sea stars, were feeding on the mussels to keep their numbers at bay. All right, so the top of the food chain was feeding off like the next level, but that level being gone meant the levels beneath it could explode, could have huge numbers. But that second level of the food chain, if it took over, the sea stars were gone, and the mussels took over, it wiped out everything else. All right. So this idea of keystone species, in this example, the sea stars are the keystone species. You know, the sea stars weren't the most numerous, but they were having the most effect in species diversity because they were killing off the mussels. I mean, there were still mussels there, but the sea stars kept the mussel numbers low so that things at the bottom of the food chain could expand their numbers. All right. Again, in class, we're going to talk more about this experiment in Robert Payne because this is a very, very famous experiment in the history of ecology. Okay, last slide for part one. So Simpsons diversity index. So there is actually a mathematical way to measure species diversity. It's called the Simpsons diversity index. This right here is just cut and paste off the formula sheet for AP Bio. We're going to actually do examples of this using numbers in class. Let's just discuss the concept here. So this equation gives you a number from 1 to 0. A 1 means there's no diversity, which really just means there's one species. The lowest would be one example of one species, like one toad. 1 would be you have maximum diversity, and you want diversity to be highest, right? Usually the more diversity you have, the more stable the ecosystem is. And if you look at the equation, it's 1 minus, and you see there's a there's a summation symbol. Little n is the total number of organisms for a given species. So say there are toads, fish, and moss. Add up all the toads, that's little n for toads. Add up all the fish, add up all the moss. Big N is the total number of organisms of all species combined, right? And you do the fraction, you divide them, square it, add all those numbers up, and then subtract them from 1, right? So if there was only one example of one species, this is 1 over 1, squared is 1, 1 minus 1 is 0. If you have lots of species, if you have like a few examples of lots of species, this number will be very, very small because you square it, you add them up, it's very, very small. 1 minus that would be a big number, which would give you lots of diversity. All right. It's a very simple equation to use, and the AP exam gives you all of this. So this is not one that's difficult. We'll do examples of it in class. But for this slide, just know that you get 0 to 1. A 1 means max diversity. A 0 means minimal or no diversity, as in you only have one of one species. Okay, so that is video 1 for ecology. We're going to call it a day there. And I hope that was helpful, and I will see you guys next time.